A routine renovation turned into a real shock. A man decided to replace the old staircase in his house, but under the concrete he found something no one could have imagined. A secret that had been hidden for decades turned the whole family's life upside down. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The first rays of the morning sun spread across the quiet Michigan neighborhood, spilling a golden light over the trees that stood like watchmen at the edges of each property. It was a morning like countless others, yet for one man, it carried the weight of a new beginning. Marcus Johnson stood on the cracked walkway leading to the house he had finally managed to call his own, his chest swelling with pride and disbelief. After decades of uncertainty, years of work without pause, and a lifetime of moving from one unstable situation to another, here it was. A place that belonged entirely to him and his family. The house itself was not much by anyone else's measure. Its white paint had long since peeled away in strips, leaving behind patches of weathered wood. The roof sagged slightly, hinting at years of neglect, and the once grand porch had given in to rot and time. But to Marcus, it was perfect. He could see past the scars of age to the promise underneath. Where others might have seen decay, he saw potential. For as long as he could remember, Marcus had been chasing a dream that always seemed just out of reach. Growing up, his family had never known permanence. His mother had worked herself to the bone to keep them fed, yet they moved from place to place with a painful frequency. Sometimes at the whim of landlords, other times because there simply wasn't enough money to keep a roof over their heads. As a boy, Marcus had longed for the kind of stability other children seemed to take for granted. The same bedroom year after year, the same neighborhood where he could build friendships that would last longer than a season. Instead, his life had been a whirlwind of goodbyes and fresh starts. Those restless years had left scars, but they had also carved into him an iron determination. One day, he promised himself, he would give his children the sense of belonging he never had. Now, standing in front of the weather-beaten house with his wife and 3 young children waiting inside, Marcus felt the gravity of that promise settling into place. This house was not simply 4 walls and a roof. It was the end of a long fight. It was his chance to rewrite history for his family. He traced his hand along the splintered wooden railing of the porch, imagining it smoothed and painted, sturdy and welcoming. He pictured evenings where he would sit on the steps with his children, watching them chase fireflies across the lawn. He imagined Christmas mornings when the house would be filled with warmth and laughter, or quiet Sundays when the smell of his wife's cooking drifted through the rooms. The house, in all its imperfections, already carried those memories waiting to be made. Yet, as much as Marcus admired the place, he knew it would demand more than a little effort. The yard was overgrown, weeds choking the flower beds and grass climbing high against the walls. The shutters hung crookedly, creaking in the wind, and the siding bore the faded scars of storms. Inside, the wallpaper peeled in the corners, floors creaked with every step, and dust lingered in the air like a stubborn reminder of abandonment. None of it deterred Marcus. To him, these flaws were invitations. Every loose board, every cracked surface whispered of a challenge, and he had always met challenges head-on. The most glaring issue, however, was the staircase at the front. The concrete steps were crumbling, cracked down the center, with weeds sprouting defiantly from the crevices. It was not just an eyesore, but a hazard. Marcus had watched his 3-year-old stumble on the uneven surface the day they first visited the property, his small body nearly toppling forward. The memory replayed in his mind now, reminding him that this was not something that could wait. A safe and solid staircase would be the first gift he gave to his family in their new home. It would be a foundation in the most literal sense, a signal that the house could truly become theirs. That night, long after his children had gone to sleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and pen, sketching out his plans. The table itself bore grooves and scratches from years of use, and he liked the thought that some family before them had gathered here in the same way. He leaned over the paper, lost in his thoughts, as the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. His wife walked past him with a tired smile, her hand brushing gently over his shoulder as she whispered that he should come to bed. He only nodded, eyes fixed on the drawing of the staircase he intended to build. In his mind, he could already see it. Broad, even steps leading up to a porch reborn. Strong enough to last decades, strong enough to carry the laughter of his children running up and down, strong enough to hold the weight of the life they were building together. Morning came quickly, and Marcus wasted no time. The sun rose into a sky brushed with pale blue, a soft breeze carrying the scent of cut grass from somewhere down the street. He stood outside with his tools, sledgehammer, chisel, shovel, laid out neatly by his side. His palms itched with anticipation, his heart pounding in rhythm with the possibilities that lay ahead. As he looked at the cracked steps once more, he felt both nervousness and joy. Nervous because every swing of the hammer would be a step deeper into the unknown history of this house. Joy because he was finally able to shape that history with his own hands. He thought of his children watching from the window, their faces pressed against the glass, curious and excited. For them, this was simply a game, an adventure their father was embarking on. For Marcus, it was so much more. It was the beginning of healing, the act of planting roots after a lifetime of drifting. He raised the hammer for the first time, his muscles tightening as he swung it down with a sharp crack against the surface. The sound echoed through the yard, scattering a small flock of birds into the sky. He paused, letting the vibration settle in his arms, a grin tugging at his lips. This was the sound of progress. As the day unfolded, he lost himself in the rhythm of his labor. The swing of the hammer, the break of the concrete, the rush of satisfaction with each piece that gave way. Sweat trickled down his face, soaking into his shirt, yet he worked with unrelenting focus. He thought of his mother, how she had carried their family through storms, and he felt her strength in his arms now. He thought of his children's future, and each strike seemed to carve a safer path for them. The steps crumbled slowly, stubbornly, but Marcus would not be deterred. By evening, he had broken through more than half of the structure. Dust clung to his skin, and his muscles ached with a pleasant heaviness. As he gathered his tools, he looked back at the progress with pride. The stairs, once jagged and broken, were now reduced to scattered chunks across the lawn. Tomorrow he would continue, and soon he would rebuild. He turned toward the house, where the warm glow of light spilled from the windows, and felt a sense of peace settle over him. This house was no longer just a purchase. It was becoming a home, brick by brick, step by step. What Marcus could not have known, as he stepped inside to join his family, was that the staircase he had chosen as the symbol of new beginnings carried more than just cracks and weeds. Beneath its crumbling surface lay a secret hidden for generations, a story waiting to rise from the shadows of history. The man who had spent his life searching for stability was about to uncover something that would challenge his understanding of home, of family, and of the very ground on which he stood. And so, with the first day of work behind him, Marcus closed his eyes that night believing he was only rebuilding stairs. In truth, he was on the brink of unraveling a mystery that would bind his family's story to those who had walked these halls long before him. The following morning, Marcus woke before the sun had fully risen, his body still aching from the previous day's work, but his mind restless with anticipation. Sleep had been light, broken by half-dreams of hammer strikes and falling stone, and by the time dawn crept through the blinds, he was already wide awake. He eased out of bed so as not to disturb his wife, whose soft breathing continued undisturbed beside him, and padded quietly down the narrow hallway. The air inside the house carried the faint coolness of night, mingled with the dry scent of dust and aged wood. For Marcus, even that smell carried a certain comfort. He poured himself a cup of coffee in the dim kitchen and stood by the window, staring out at the yard where his tools still rested by the fractured steps. There was a weight in his chest that morning, heavier than the pride he had felt the day before. As the caffeine warmed his veins, he realized it was not only determination that filled him, but also the creeping edges of doubt. Yesterday, each blow of the hammer had felt like liberation, the sound of progress echoing in his ears. But in the quiet of the morning, those same echoes seemed less triumphant and more unsettling. Something about the way the ground had given way beneath his hammer bothered him. The crack of concrete had not been uniform. Some strikes rang hollow, as though beneath the solid stone lay not earth, but an emptiness. He told himself it was nothing unusual, simply pockets of loosened dirt or the natural irregularities of construction. Yet still, unease pressed against the back of his mind. By the time his children stirred from their sleep, Marcus had already stepped outside, mug in one hand and shovel in the other. The early light painted the world in pale gold, the dew clinging to the blades of grass, and the cracked staircase waited for him like a puzzle half solved. He set the mug on the railing and took up the sledgehammer once again. The steel felt heavy but familiar in his hands, the worn grip fit in his palms as if it belonged there. He squared his shoulders, inhaled deeply, and swung. The hammer came down with a satisfying crunch, sending another shard of concrete flying. A cloud of dust rose into the air, catching the sunlight in a pale shimmer. He swung again and again, letting the rhythm take hold, each strike loosening the stubborn remains of the old stairs. Sweat dampened his brow despite the cool morning breeze, his breaths coming deeper with the exertion. The work was grueling, but there was a strange peace in it as well, a simplicity that his life had rarely offered him. Then came the sound that made him pause. A metallic reverberation rang out beneath the hammer's blow, sharp and unexpected against the dull crumble of stone. Marcus froze. The hammer balanced loosely in his grip, his heart giving a startled thump. He leaned forward, brushing aside the shards with his gloved hand, and struck again, more carefully this time. The same ringing sound answered him, faint but undeniable. It was not the voice of concrete or soil. Something else was hidden beneath the steps. He straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing on the fractured ground, and for a moment his imagination rushed ahead of him. A buried pipe, perhaps? Some long-forgotten scrap of metal discarded during construction? Or, his mind leapt further, could it be something else entirely? Stories his mother used to tell him as a boy flickered through his memory. Hidden treasures buried by desperate hands, lost possessions swallowed by time. He shook his head and tried to laugh at himself, but the sound came out hollow. Determined to know more, he swung the hammer with sharper precision, chipping away around the source of the sound. With each strike, his anticipation mounted, and so too did his unease. The earth beneath his home seemed to breathe differently, as if the ground itself held back a secret it did not wish to share. The hollow echo returned again and again, until Marcus dropped the hammer and crouched low, his fingertips brushing through the broken dust and stone. There it was, a corner of something harder, smoother than the jagged concrete. He tapped it with his knuckles, and the metallic ring confirmed it. His throat tightened, not with fear exactly, but with a deep, pressing curiosity. He dug at the edges with his hands, scraping away the debris until the outline of the object became clearer. It was larger than he expected, and the more he uncovered, the more baffling it seemed. The edges were too straight, too deliberate to be a random fragment buried in the soil. This had been placed here with intent. As he worked, the voices of his children carried faintly from the house. They were laughing at something, perhaps chasing one another through the hallways, oblivious to the strange turn their father's labor had taken. He envied their ignorance in that moment. For while they played in innocence, Marcus felt the tug of something older, something rooted in the bones of this house. He paused to catch his breath, leaning back on his heels, the sweat running in rivulets down his temple. The air seemed heavier now, pressing down around him as though the house itself were holding its breath. He told himself again that it was probably nothing. A builder's refuse, perhaps. Houses of this age were often full of surprises, but rarely the kind that carried significance. And yet, the thought refused to settle in his mind. He knew instinctively that whatever lay beneath these steps was not simply debris. It had been concealed, deliberately hidden away, and he could not ignore the pull of that mystery. The day stretched on, the sun climbing higher overhead as Marcus chipped away more of the steps. The pile of rubble at his side grew taller, and with each piece removed, the object beneath revealed itself inch by inch. His muscles screamed in protest, his back ached, but he pressed on with a determination that felt greater than himself. He had started this project to give his family safety, a proper entrance into their new life. Now he realized he was being drawn into something deeper, something that connected the foundation of their future with the shadows of the past. By evening, he had exposed enough to confirm that it was indeed a box of some kind, its surface dulled by age and streaked with rust. It was wedged firmly into the ground, as though the earth had grown around it, reluctant to give it back. He sat beside it, chest heaving, his gloves stained with soil, and stared at it in silence. His heart raced not with exhaustion, but with the thrill of discovery and the chill of uncertainty. As twilight descended, Marcus gathered his tools and stood on unsteady legs, his gaze lingering on the partially unearthed box. The shadows stretched long across the yard, and the cicadas had begun their evening chorus. He felt the weight of the day pressing down on him, but more than that, he felt the weight of the unknown. Tomorrow he would return to finish what he had begun. For tonight, he would sit with the knowledge that his house, the home he had dreamed of for so long, was not merely old. It was a keeper of secrets, and in his effort to rebuild, he had stumbled upon a doorway to a story not yet told. When he stepped back inside, his children rushed to greet him, their small arms wrapping around his legs, their voices tumbling over each other in excitement about the day's little adventures. His wife looked at him closely, sensing the unease behind his tired smile, but she said nothing. He kissed her cheek and whispered that the stairs were coming along. As the family settled into their nightly routine, Marcus could not shake the image of the box beneath the steps, waiting in silence. His doubts, which had seemed so fleeting that morning, now clung to him like shadows. The cracks in the staircase were more than simple flaws of stone. They were openings, fissures into a past that had chosen him, of all people, to uncover it. And, as sleep finally claimed him, one thought followed him into the dark. Tomorrow, the box would be his to open. Morning returned heavy with mist, the kind that clung to the grass and hung like a veil across the neighborhood. Marcus stood once again at the front of the house, the air damp against his skin, the memory of the previous day still pressing on his mind like a weight that refused to lift. He stared at the half-broken staircase, the mound of rubble he had left scattered across the yard, and at the faint outline of the box that now jutted from the earth like some ancient relic struggling to breathe free. It looked smaller in the pale light, unassuming even, yet Marcus felt a strange reverence as he approached it, as though he were intruding upon something sacred. His muscles still ached from the labor, but there was no question of hesitation. He had lived his whole life yearning for stability, for permanence, and now he felt as though the house itself had chosen him to bear witness to its secrets. He tightened his gloves, took up the hammer again, and set to work clearing the last of the steps that stubbornly guarded the box. Each strike of the hammer echoed differently now. No longer was it the rhythmic destruction of concrete, but the deliberate chipping away of a mystery that had lain dormant for generations. With every piece that crumbled away, Marcus's heartbeat grew louder in his chest. By mid-morning, the remnants of the staircase lay in jagged heaps, and the box was nearly exposed. He crouched down, brushing the dirt from its surface with his calloused hands. The wood was cracked and swollen, darkened by years of dampness. Rust clung thick to the iron nails and hinges, the air round it carrying the faint metallic tang of time itself. He tapped one corner lightly, listening to the hollow response it gave back. Whatever lay inside was waiting for him. For a long moment, Marcus simply knelt there, his hands resting on the box, his mind drifting back and forth between excitement and unease. It could be nothing, he told himself. Old tools, discarded scraps, the mundane refuse of construction. Yet another voice whispered insistently at the back of his mind, urging him to believe that this was more. He thought of the house, its worn shutters and peeling walls, its tired floors groaning with every step. How many stories had unfolded here before his own family arrived? How many lives had come and gone, leaving traces like fingerprints pressed into the very foundation? Taking a steadying breath, Marcus wedged the claw of his hammer beneath the lid and pried. The wood resisted, creaking as though unwilling to surrender its contents, but at last it gave way with a sudden snap. The lid splintered under his strength, and the musty air of the box rose up, earthy and sour with age. He coughed, waving the dust aside, then peered into the darkness within. What he saw first were shapes, rounded, glinting faintly through the haze of dust. He reached in and drew one out, brushing the grime from its surface. A coin lay in his hand, cool and heavy, its edges worn, but the faint markings of its age still visible. Marcus blinked, his chest tightening as he realized what he was holding. It was no ordinary coin from a handful of years past, but a silver piece from a time long gone. He reached in again, and another came free. Copper this time, dull with tarnish, yet unmistakably old. The bottom of the box glimmered faintly beneath the layer of dirt and newspaper that lined it. Dozens, no, hundreds of coins waited inside, stacked and scattered like the remnants of a forgotten fortune. Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled free a bundle of paper. The sheets were yellowed and brittle, crumbling at the edges, the ink faded but not erased. Headlines leapt out at him in bold letters, their language stark and familiar from history books. Talk of economic collapse, of breadlines, of a nation struggling under the weight of despair. Dates in the early 1930s marked the margins, confirming what his race and mind already knew. This treasure was not random, not careless. It had been placed here deliberately, hidden with the desperation of a family caught in the grip of the Great Depression. Beneath the bundles of coins and brittle newsprint lay something else. Marcus lifted it carefully, his breath catching as the dim outlines of faces emerged. Photographs, worn and speckled with age, but clear enough to reveal the features of the people captured within them. A man stood stiffly in the center, his arm around a woman who smiled faintly despite the tiredness in her eyes. Two children, no older than Marcus's youngest, sat at their feet, their solemn expressions betraying none of the laughter children were meant to carry. He turned the photo over, and faint handwriting revealed names and a year that seemed impossibly far removed from his own. The discovery struck him with a force he had not expected. These were not just objects. They were fragments of lives once lived within these same walls. This was not simply his house. It had belonged to others who had walked its floors, dreamed within its rooms, fought battles unseen. The coins and photographs were their testimony, their desperate attempt to hold on, to save what little they could in a time when the world itself seemed to collapse around them. Marcus sat back on his heels, the photo trembling in his hands. Around him, the yard lay quiet, the mist long since burned away by the sun. Yet he felt as though the air carried whispers, voices of the past echoing faintly around him. He looked again at the box, at the stacks of coins and the fragile documents, and realized that what he had uncovered was not merely a hidden cache, but a story buried beneath stone and time. His excitement warred with unease. On one hand, he marveled at the magnitude of his discovery. He had always dreamed of finding something extraordinary, of stumbling upon history with his own two hands. On the other, he felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. These items had belonged to a family, one who had lived through hardship beyond his imagination. To disturb them felt intrusive, as though he were trespassing into a life that was not his own. Still, he could not look away. He lifted another photograph, this one of the children alone, their hands clasped tightly together. Their eyes, frozen in that moment decades ago, seemed to meet his across the gulf of time. It was as if they were asking him not to forget them, not to let their struggles vanish into silence. Marcus swallowed hard, tucking the pictures back into the box with trembling care. By late afternoon, the coins lay in neat piles beside him, their metallic glint catching the waning sunlight. The box, now empty of its heaviest secrets, seemed lighter but no less haunting. Marcus leaned back, his mind racing with questions. Who were they? This family whose lives had intersected with his own. Why had their savings remained hidden beneath the steps, never recovered, never spent? What fate had pulled them away from the home they had tried so desperately to preserve? As the shadows stretched long and the air cooled, Marcus carried the box inside, setting it carefully in a corner of the living room. His wife watched him, her eyes curious but cautious, sensing his unease. He offered no explanation yet, his voice caught in his throat, his mind still lost in the faces that stared up at him from the fragile photographs. That night, long after the house had grown silent, Marcus sat alone by the box, the coins glimmering faintly in the lamplight. He felt the chill of the past reaching out, settling into his bones, reminding him that a home was more than walls and wood. It was a vessel of lives, of stories, of secrets, and he had just unearthed one that would not let him go. What had begun as a simple act of renovation had become something else entirely. The broken steps no longer seemed like a project of stone and mortar, but the threshold to a history that demanded to be uncovered. Marcus knew that his journey into the past of this house had only just begun, and whatever awaited him in its depths, he was already bound to it. The night had been restless for Marcus. Long after the last lamp had been switched off and the house had sunk into silence, he sat hunched over the old box in the living room, the dim glow of a single bulb casting elongated shadows across the walls. The coins, stacked carefully in small towers on the floor, caught the light in dull flashes, and the brittle newspapers lay spread open like fragile wings. Beside them were the photographs, faces staring back at him from another time, their eyes fixed with the kind of solemnity that refused to be ignored. Marcus had turned each one over in his hands again and again, studying every crease, every smudge, as though the paper itself might whisper its secrets to him if only he held it long enough. When dawn finally came, it found him still there, his elbows resting on his knees, his head heavy with the weight of sleepless hours. His wife entered quietly, pausing in the doorway with a look of concern. She did not scold him for staying up or for dragging the relics of the past into their home. Instead, she simply asked if he was ready for breakfast, her voice soft, almost hesitant, as though she too felt the intrusion of the house's ghosts. Marcus managed a tired smile and shook his head. He was not hungry. Something deeper than appetite gripped him now. He carried the photographs back to the table and laid them out carefully, arranging them in a line as though trying to piece together a family portrait that time had torn apart. The man, stiff and unsmiling, with broad shoulders and a hard jaw. The woman, her smile faint but present, her eyes carrying both tenderness and fatigue. The children, whose expressions revealed a weight they should never have borne at such an age. These were not strangers to him any longer. They were the former life of his house, their essence still clinging to the very bones of the structure. The newspapers added another layer to the story. Headlines about the stock market crash, about banks failing, about unemployment rising in terrifying numbers. One article spoke of local families forced to abandon their farms, unable to pay taxes or keep their homes from foreclosure. Another described men lining up outside soup kitchens, their hats pulled low to hide the shame of hunger. Marcus traced the faded ink with his finger, his heart aching as he imagined the man in the photograph clutching those very coins, praying that saving them would mean survival. The coins themselves were not random pocket change. Many were silver dollars, their surfaces worn from use, but still carrying the proud eagle stamped into the back. Others were smaller, copper pennies and nickels, gathered together with desperate patience. Some of the bundles were wrapped in thin strips of parchment, tied with twine that had long since frayed. Marcus untied one carefully, the knot giving way to reveal a set of coins dated year after year in careful succession, like a record of perseverance, of hope stubbornly clung to even as the world around collapsed. It dawned on him slowly that this was not the stash of a miser or the hidden wealth of someone greedy. This was survival, a lifeline buried away in the very foundation of the house. Each coin represented a meal, a pair of shoes, a chance at a future. Yet here they remained, untouched, left behind when they were needed most. That thought unsettled Marcus deeply. Why had they never been retrieved? Why would a family save with such determination only to abandon their treasure beneath the stairs? The answer, whatever it was, lingered just out of reach, heavy and unresolved. Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself wandering through the empty rooms of the house, his fingers trailing across the cracked wallpaper, his footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floorboards. He imagined the family who had lived here before, filling these same spaces with their voices, their laughter, their fears. He could almost hear the children running down the hallway, almost see the woman standing by the window, the man wiping sweat from his brow after a long day's work. The house had seemed quiet and lifeless when they first bought it, but now it was alive with memory, every creak of the floor a reminder of the lives that had passed through. As evening drew near, Marcus returned to the box and once again studied the photographs. This time, something caught his attention he had missed before. On the back of one of the images, written in faded ink, was not just a year, but also a phrase: "For when better days return." The words hit him like a blow. They were not just saving coins for survival. They were saving for a future they believed would come, a time when hardship would ease, when they could stand on firmer ground again. These coins were not only sustenance, they were hope itself, sealed away beneath the stairs like a promise. Marcus felt his throat tighten, and he set the photograph down carefully, his eyes stinging with the force of emotions he could not quite name. He thought of his own children, sleeping safely in their rooms upstairs, unaware of the ghosts their father was unearthing. He thought of his mother, who had fought through her own storms to give him the chance to stand where he stood now. Generations bound together by struggle, by resilience, by the need to protect those they loved. The faces in the photographs may have been strangers, but Marcus felt their story intertwining with his own. That night, as he lay in bed beside his wife, sleep eluded him again. The house seemed to breathe around him, the wind outside rattling the shutters like voices pressing to be heard. He stared at the ceiling, the words, "For when better days return," circling endlessly in his thoughts. It felt as though the family from the past had entrusted him with their secret, chosen him to bear the weight of their unfulfilled hope. He could not ignore it, nor could he dismiss it as mere curiosity. He was tied to them now, bound by the discovery of what they had left behind. When dawn came again, Marcus knew that his journey was no longer about rebuilding stairs. It was about uncovering the truth. He needed to understand who they had been, what had become of them, and why their treasure had been left untouched for so long. The mystery was no longer just beneath his feet. It was inside him, pulling at him with every passing moment. And though he did not yet know the answers, he understood that this was only the beginning. The house had spoken, and he had no choice but to listen. The house seemed different in the days that followed, as though the discovery beneath the stairs had altered not just Marcus's perception, but the air itself within the walls. He walked from room to room and could no longer see only the cracks in the plaster or the sagging beams that demanded repair. Now he sensed presences, shadows of those who had lived here before, lingering just beyond reach. The box of coins and photographs had unsettled something deep in him, a recognition that this was no longer merely his house. It was a vessel of lives once lived, a keeper of memory, and he had forced open a chapter that had remained sealed for decades. Every evening after work, after the children had been fed and put to bed, Marcus found himself returning to the box. He would sit alone in the dim light, turning the photographs over in his hands, his eyes drawn again and again to the children's faces. Their solemn gaze seemed to pierce through the thin veil of time, their hands clasped tightly together as if holding on to one another against forces too great to withstand. He saw his own children in them, innocent yet burdened by circumstances beyond their control, and the thought weighed on him until his chest ached. It was impossible not to imagine the lives those children had been forced into, the hardships they endured, and the uncertain fate that had torn them away from this house, leaving their family's careful savings behind. The coins themselves had begun to feel less like treasure and more like testimony. At first, the sight of them had stirred something close to excitement, the thrill of uncovering a hidden fortune. But that feeling had quickly given way to unease, for the more he examined them, the more he understood what they truly represented. Each silver dollar, each copper penny was not an object of wealth, but of desperation. They were meals denied, clothes forgone, comforts sacrificed. They were hope squeezed into metal, stashed away with trembling hands in the belief that one day life would be kinder. To possess them now felt almost like theft, a violation of the silent pact that family had made with the future. Marcus began to question himself endlessly. What right did he have to these things? Legally, of course, the house was his, and everything within its soil belonged to him. But the law felt hollow compared to the pull of conscience. Could he keep them, knowing what they had meant? Could he spend them, as though they were nothing more than old currency? The thought turned his stomach. Even storing them away in some locked drawer seemed wrong, as though he were hoarding the remnants of another's suffering. These thoughts followed him through his days, distracting him from work, intruding upon conversations with his wife and children. He would catch himself staring at his children's faces as they ate their breakfast or played in the yard, seeing echoes of the children in the photographs, and the unease returned stronger than before. He wanted to give his own family everything, to shield them from hardship, to build a home that would stand against time. Yet now he realized he was standing atop the dreams of another family that had tried and failed. Their story had ended in silence and absence, and only the coins remained to speak for them. One evening, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table with the photographs spread before him. The house was quiet, the rhythmic ticking of the clock the only sound to accompany his thoughts. He traced a finger along the words scrawled on the back of one photograph, "For when better days return," and felt a chill run through him. Those words had not been meant for him. They had been a promise, perhaps a prayer, written in faith that one day life would ease. Yet it was he who held them now, decades too late, unable to return them to the hands that had written them. The weight of that realization pressed on him until he felt he could hardly breathe. He rose from the table and walked through the house, his footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floor. He paused at the threshold of each room, imagining it as it might have been long ago. The dining room filled with laughter and chatter, the kitchen thick with the smell of stew, the upstairs hall echoing with children's voices. But alongside these visions came darker ones, arguments whispered in hushed tones, nights spent counting coins and praying they would last, the slow erosion of hope as the depression ground them down. He could almost feel the despair lingering in the walls, and it mingled with his own fears for the future. For Marcus was not without his own burdens. The mortgage on the house was steep, his work demanding, his savings thin. He carried the pressure of being the provider, of ensuring that his wife and children never knew the instability he had endured as a boy. And now, staring into the shadowed past of the family who had once lived here, he saw how fragile that hope could be. They had tried, as he was trying. They had saved, sacrificed, dreamed, and still their story had ended with coins buried beneath the stairs and their faces left to fade in photographs. The parallel unsettled him deeply. Was he, too, destined to fail despite his efforts? Was the house itself a reminder that no matter how hard one tried, life could sweep everything away? He shook his head, refusing to accept the thought, yet it clung to him stubbornly, a whisper in the dark. He wanted to believe that he could do better, that he could give his children what he had promised, but the coins on the table seemed to mock that resolve, silent witnesses to the fragility of even the strongest intentions. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself caught in an invisible tug-of-war. Part of him longed to treat the discovery as a gift, a quirk of fate that had delivered him a treasure. He thought briefly of selling some of the coins, of using the money to ease their own struggles. But the idea filled him with guilt so sharp it was almost physical. Another part of him wanted to return the box to the earth, to cover it once more and let the past rest undisturbed. Yet, even that felt wrong. He had uncovered their story, and to bury it again would be to silence voices that deserved to be heard. And so he sat with the conflict unresolved, the coins still stacked in quiet towers on the table, the photographs laid out like solemn judges over his indecision. His wife watched him with growing worry, though she did not press him. She understood, in her own way, that something profound had taken hold of him, something that reached beyond the practical matters of money and ownership. This was not just about what to do with the coins. It was about what it meant to carry the weight of another family's hope, to live in a house that was not empty but saturated with memory. One night, unable to sleep, Marcus rose from bed and walked outside. The air was cool, the sky stretched wide above him, filled with stars. He stood at the edge of the rubble where the staircase had been and looked down at the ground where the box had lain. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the man in the photograph standing in this same spot, hammer in hand, building the stairs above his hidden treasure, each strike echoing with determination and fear. He imagined the woman watching from the doorway, the children playing nearby, unaware of the desperation that pressed on their parents. He felt them there, not as strangers, but as reflections of himself, bound by the same need to protect, to provide, to endure. When he opened his eyes, the weight in his chest had not lifted, but it had changed. He no longer saw the coins as a burden alone, but as a bridge. They were a connection between past and present, between his family and theirs, a reminder that struggle was not unique to him. Others had walked this path before, had fought and fallen, and their story was now part of his own. He did not yet know what to do with their treasure, but he knew he could not ignore it. It had become part of him, woven into the fabric of his days, pressing him to seek answers. And so, as he turned back toward the house, Marcus understood that the time had come to look beyond his own walls. If he wanted to honor what he had found, he needed to know more. He needed to uncover the truth of the family who had lived here, to learn why their hope had been buried and abandoned. Only then could he decide what to do. Only then could he find peace with the weight of their legacy pressing upon his shoulders. The house slept as he stepped quietly inside, his wife and children undisturbed. Yet Marcus felt the walls watching, listening, urging him onward. The past had spoken, and he could no longer turn away. The decision to search for answers did not come to Marcus all at once. It grew gradually, seated in restless nights and silent mornings, until it became an undeniable weight on his conscience. He could not shake the feeling that the coins, the photographs, and the brittle newspapers were more than artifacts. They were threads dangling from a larger tapestry, and he had only brushed his fingertips against the edges of a story that demanded to be known. The house had yielded its secret reluctantly, and now Marcus felt chosen, perhaps even entrusted, to bring light to what time had hidden away. His first step was the library downtown, a red brick building whose heavy wooden doors opened into the scent of paper, dust, and memory. It had been years since Marcus had walked through its aisles, but something about the solemn quiet there seemed right for the task he had set himself. He carried with him one of the photographs and a folded newspaper clipping, careful not to damage them further. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind but sharp eyes, leaned over her desk when he asked about property records and family histories. She regarded the worn photo with interest, her lips pressed into a thoughtful line, and directed him to the archives on the second floor. Marcus spent hours hunched over microfilm machines and faded ledgers, his fingers tracing names and dates that blurred together in dizzying repetition. But persistence had always been his strength, and as the afternoon deepened into evening, he began to piece together fragments. The surname, written faintly on the back of one photograph, matched records from the 1930s. The family had lived at his address during the hardest years of the Depression. Census records revealed a father employed at a local mill, a mother listed as homemaker, two children with ages that matched the faces in the photographs. There were notes of delinquent taxes, court filings that hinted at foreclosure, and then, abruptly, the trail ended. The family disappeared from the records as though swallowed by the storm of history. The discovery unsettled him more than if he had found their lives neatly documented. To fade so suddenly from the public eye meant upheaval, loss, perhaps tragedy. He closed the last ledger with trembling hands, his mind alive with questions. Did they leave town in search of better fortune? Were they driven out by poverty, forced into the endless migration that had scattered so many families in those years? Or had something worse claimed them? The silence of the records spoke louder than any words, and Marcus left the library with the photograph clutched tightly in his pocket, the unanswered questions gnawing at him. That night, he could not keep his discoveries to himself. He spread the photographs and documents across the table, showing them to his wife. Her brow furrowed as she studied the faces, her hand resting lightly on one of the children's images. She said little, but Marcus could see the same recognition in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. These were not nameless strangers any longer. They were a family whose voices had been silenced, whose story had been cut short, and they had lived within the same walls that now sheltered his children. The gravity of that realization bound them both in a quiet understanding. Days passed, and Marcus sought out other avenues. He visited the county courthouse, requesting more records, only to be met with the limits of what time had preserved. He spoke with neighbors, particularly the older ones, in hopes of stirring memories. Most had moved to the area long after the Depression, yet one man, bent with age and sharp of memory, recalled hearing his own father mention a family by that name. "They had it rough," the old man said, his voice rasping with the weight of years. "Lost the farm they'd had for generations. Folks said they tried to hold on here, but the banks were merciless back then. One day they were gone, and no one knew where to." The words struck Marcus like a cold wind. He thanked the man and walked home in silence, his mind filled with images of a family loading their meager belongings into a wagon or a rusted car, leaving behind not only their home, but also their carefully guarded treasure. The coins were not abandoned by neglect, but by necessity, perhaps too heavy to carry, perhaps hidden in hopes of one day returning. But the return had never come. Their legacy had been left to the soil, waiting for someone else's hands to unearth it. As his investigation deepened, Marcus began to feel the house differently. The creak of its floors no longer seemed random, but rhythmic, like echoes of footsteps from long ago. The wind that rattled its shutters sounded less like weather and more like whispers threading through the gaps. At times, when he stood alone in the dim light of evening, he felt almost as though the walls leaned in, urging him to listen harder, to dig deeper, to understand. The line between past and present blurred, the lives of the family who had gone before intertwining with his own until he could not separate them. Yet, the closer he drew to their story, the heavier it weighed on him. He began to dream of them, vivid images of the father at the table counting coins, of the mother wrapping them carefully in newspaper, of the children watching silently, their eyes far too old for their years. In these dreams, Marcus often reached for them only to wake with his hands empty, the weight of their absence pressing on his chest. He would lie awake for hours afterward, staring into the dark, knowing that their ghosts had made a home in his heart. It was during one such restless night that Marcus realized what troubled him most. It was not simply the mystery of who they had been or what had happened to them. It was the injustice of their silence, the fact that their struggle had gone unremembered, their hope buried beneath the ground to be forgotten by time. They had saved not just coins, but fragments of their lives, and it had all lain in darkness until his hammer cracked open the stone above. Now that he had seen it, he could not turn away. He had a duty to them, a responsibility to ensure that their story would not vanish into dust. In the days that followed, he began writing. At first, it was only notes in a worn notebook, dates and names and guesses, but soon it became more than that. He wrote about the faces in the photographs, about the desperation implied by the coins, about the words scrawled on the back of the picture, for when better days return. He wrote about his own life, about the parallels he saw between himself and the father in the images, both men striving for stability, both dreaming of giving their families a better tomorrow. Writing became his way of giving them voice, of stitching their forgotten story into the fabric of the present. And as he wrote, something inside him shifted. The unease that had haunted him began to ease, replaced by a sense of communion. He was no longer simply a man who had stumbled upon an old box beneath the stairs. He was part of a continuum, a link in the chain of families who had called this house their own. Their struggles were his struggles, their hope his hope, and though he could not change their fate, he could carry their story forward. One evening, as he read over the words he had written, Marcus looked up and saw his children playing on the floor, their laughter echoing through the room. He glanced back at the photographs, at the children whose faces stared back from the past, and felt a quiet resolution settle in his heart. He could not save them, but he could honor them. He could ensure that their voices were heard, that their legacy was remembered. In doing so, he might even strengthen his own family's roots, binding them more firmly to the home they were building together. The house no longer felt haunted to Marcus. It felt alive, vibrant with history, charged with the energy of those who had come before. And though the questions were not all answered, though the full truth of what had happened to that family remained hidden in the shadows of time, Marcus had begun to hear their voices. They spoke not in words, but in the silence of the photographs, in the tarnished gleam of coins, in the brittle pages of old newspapers. They spoke in the very creak of the stairs and the sigh of the wind through the shutters. And in listening, Marcus felt himself changed, humbled and fortified by the knowledge that he was not alone. He was one chapter in a story larger than himself, a story that stretched back through hardship and forward into hope. As he prepared for bed that night, Marcus paused at the window and looked out over the yard where the rubble from the staircase still lay. He knew he would rebuild it soon, strong and new, a safe passage for his family. But he also knew that beneath its steps would lie more than earth and stone. They would lie upon history itself, upon the memory of those who had walked before. And every time he set foot on those stairs, he would remember. The days after Marcus's long hours in the library and his restless nights filled with dreams of the past brought with them a new clarity. The burden of doubt that had weighed on him since the discovery of the box did not vanish, but it transformed into something steadier, something that resembled a calling. He no longer felt that he was trespassing into another family's secrets, nor did he believe that the coins and photographs belonged to him alone. Instead, he began to see himself as a bridge, a caretaker of something larger than possession. The box and its contents had been entrusted to him by chance, but chance was enough. He had been chosen to carry their story forward, to ensure that the voices of those who had come before did not fade into silence. The first steps he took were careful. He gathered the most fragile of the photographs, slipping them into protective sleeves he had purchased at a local shop, and placed them in a binder. The coins he cleaned lightly with a cloth, careful not to strip away the patina of age that marked their long journey through time. Each action carried with it a sense of reverence, as though he were performing a ritual rather than a task. His wife watched quietly as he worked, sensing the solemnity in his movements, and though she asked few questions, she supported him with her steady presence. The children, too young to grasp the full weight of what their father was doing, knew only that he was handling something important. Their curious eyes followed him, their questions bubbling up only to be quieted by his gentle replies. One day, he promised himself, he would tell them everything. Marcus knew he could not keep the story locked within his home. To do so would be to repeat the silence that had already stretched for generations. And so he reached out to the local historical society, a modest organization housed in an old building downtown, its rooms lined with displays of tools, clothing, and documents that told the tale of the town's long history. He made an appointment, and one crisp morning he carried the binder of photographs and a selection of coins with him, the box itself left safely at home. The historian who greeted him was a man in his 50s, his face lined not with hardship but with years of study, his voice warm with curiosity. Marcus explained how he had come upon the items, careful not to embellish, and laid them out on the table. The historian's eyes widened as he examined the photographs, his fingers hovering just above the brittle paper without touching it. He murmured dates and observations, nodding to himself, and when he looked up his gaze carried both awe and gravity. These were valuable, he explained, not in the sense of money alone, but as windows into a forgotten chapter of the town's past. Families like the one Marcus had discovered had built the community, endured its darkest days, and vanished without their stories being written. To bring them forward now was to give the town a gift, memory restored. Marcus listened, the tension in his chest loosening, and when the historian asked if the society might display some of the photographs and coins in their collection, Marcus agreed without hesitation. He did not want them hidden away in shadows again. They deserved to be seen. That evening, returning home with his binder lighter than before, Marcus felt a sense of peace he had not known in weeks. His children ran to him as he stepped through the door, their laughter filling the hallway, and he bent to embrace them, breathing in the warmth of their small bodies. He looked around at the house, the peeling paint, the sagging beams, the stubborn flaws, and saw it differently now. It was not merely his home, not merely a structure to be repaired. It was a vessel of stories, a place where past and present intertwined. By honoring the family who had come before, he had also fortified his own family's foundation. The work on the staircase resumed in the days that followed, and though Marcus's body ached with the labor, his heart was lighter. Stone by stone, step by step, he rebuilt the entrance, shaping it strong and sure, knowing that his children would run safely across it for years to come. Yet, each swing of his hammer carried with it a double rhythm, the sound of progress for his own family, and the echo of remembrance for the family whose hopes had been sealed beneath the old steps. When the new staircase was complete, it stood not only as a symbol of renewal, but as a quiet monument to those who had gone before. The coins he had kept at home, fewer now that many were entrusted to the Historical Society, he placed in a small wooden box on a shelf in the living room. One by one, he showed them to his children, explaining not the monetary value but the meaning behind them. He told them about the importance of saving, of working hard, of believing in a better future, even when the present seemed impossible. He told them about the words written on the back of the photograph, "For when better days return," and explained that sometimes better days did not come quickly, but they did come eventually, if one held on with courage. The children listened wide-eyed, perhaps not understanding fully but sensing the weight of his words. In the months that followed, the story spread beyond his home. Neighbors heard of the discovery, and many came to see the staircase and to ask about the family. Some brought their own memories, stories passed down from parents and grandparents, fragments that helped Marcus weave a fuller picture of those who had lived there before. Local newspapers ran a feature on the find, and soon Marcus's name was tied to the house not just as its current owner, but as the man who had unearthed its hidden past. He accepted the attention humbly, always redirecting it to the family whose story deserved the recognition. He had not sought fame, only understanding, and he felt at peace knowing that the voices of the past were no longer silent. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the house lay in stillness, Marcus would sometimes sit by the window, gazing out at the yard. The staircase, solid and new, gleamed faintly in the moonlight, and he thought of the box that had once lain beneath it. He thought of the coins that had been meant for survival, the photographs of a family holding fast against despair, the promise etched in fragile ink. He thought of his own life, of his mother's struggles, of his vow to give his children a home that would not slip away. And in those moments, he felt a profound connection across time, as though he were not alone in his efforts but walking hand in hand with those who had gone before. The legacy he carried was no longer a weight that bent his shoulders. It was a strength that lifted him, reminding him that every family faced trials, every generation bore burdens, but the act of enduring, of hoping, of building anew was what bound them together. His house was no longer just a place of shelter. It was a monument to resilience, a reminder that even in the hardest times, people believed in tomorrow. As the seasons turned and the house filled with laughter, with the smell of cooking, with the noise of children running through its halls, Marcus felt something he had never known in his own childhood: belonging. He had found not only a home for his family, but also a place in the long story of those who had lived and dreamed on that patch of ground. And whenever he looked at the small wooden box on the shelf or at the photographs framed on the wall, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for his own family, for the chance to build a future, and for the family of the past, whose hidden treasure had reminded him that even in silence, hope can endure. The house was whole again, not because its cracks had been repaired or its walls repainted, but because it carried within it the memory of lives intertwined. And, as Marcus stood one evening on the steps he had rebuilt, the cool breeze against his face and his children's laughter spilling from the doorway behind him, he knew that better days had indeed returned, not only for him, but for the voices of the past that now lived on through him. If you enjoyed this unbelievable story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. We've got even more shocking discoveries and real-life mysteries waiting for you in our upcoming videos. Click now to watch the next one. And if this story amazed you, share it with your friends and family. Let them experience the twist for themselves.